Sons of Devils by Alex R. Oliver, Chapter 11, in which the full horror of Radu's plan is revealed. Frank fretted uselessly for the rest of the day. Oh, he was hard at work in his capacity as a secretary, but dashing off letters did not keep him from inner turmoil. He worried his lip as he wrote a note to Starescu to make sure any fresh bodies were not buried but cremated. This will be easily passed as a precaution against the White Death, without having to reveal the true cause of our anxiety, lest we panic the public in this time of war. A longer letter to Caesar back in Valtia ordered him to gather the household troops, and as many as large deep wagons as you can bring, and to ride as swiftly as he might and join them in Bucharest. This was dispatched by one of the fast couriers, who had been cantering out from the capital all day long, as the other boyars gathered their troops and ammunition. A long series of notes exchanged with the palace official in charge of the muster brought details of the ships set aside to carry them down to Istanbul, where they would be bivouacked until the Sultan's generals had need of them. "We are cavalry," said Radu, offhand, as though surely Frank should know this already. "Not sailors. The fact that they want us at all means they are envisaging a land battle. So we can expect to be taken somewhere, perhaps to England itself, and landed there to make a frontal assault." He looked up at the sudden silence as Frank put down his pen. "I hope it will not come to that. If it does and we are landed in England, I will look the other way long enough for you to go to your own people." And that hurt too, surprisingly enough. It made Frank wonder again whether he had a people any more. How much did he owe a country that had turned him into a pariah? Was not his new home, which had taken him in when he was broken and useless, and remade him with hope, more entitled to his loyalty? Fortunately, it was a question with a simple answer. "I gave my word. I will not leave your side." Radu laughed, and cast a brisk glance at the tall windows that gave out onto the balcony. The sky was glowing like cherries above, indigo below. "Does that mean you're coming with me now? To finally hear this plan? I certainly am." Taking a lantern, they trekked back down to the chapel in the reeds. Their feet had begun to make a little path of bent and browned grass. Evening was bringing silence with it, and dew soft and cold. Along the river valley, mist thickened into fog, the same odd, washed-out silver blue of the distant stars. Frank moved a step closer to Radu, who was already losing his own colour to the dark. He was still visible enough to read his expressions, but twilight had painted him in shades of ice and midnight. The hair stood up along Frank's neck as he felt a cold far more profound than that of the night. The mist billowed, and then Elia was next to him, beautiful as the spirit of the snow, in pale blue and silver lace, dotted here and there with blood spots. Constantine stepped out of the silence next, still all in white and scarcely to be seen in the mist, with water sparkling in his beard like combed diamonds, and on his hat like pearls. There was a little brown crust corked in the hairs around his mouth and in his moustaches, and he hadn't yet shed his look of disapproval. "Mother." Radu removed Frank's restraining hand from his wrist and stepped toward both of them, smiling. "It's been too long since I've seen you. Won't you come into the house and sit with us as you used to? I've missed you." This was not what Frank had expected to hear at all, nor, judging from Constantine's surprise, had he. But Elia beamed with delight and stepped forward to hug Radu, carefully, Frank noticed, with her hands and face touching only the many layers of his coats. "I'm sorry we were harsh to you before," she said, looking up at him earnestly. "We were very eager to come here, but we shouldn't have bullied you into it. We should not have struck you. I don't know what came over me, but I promise it won't happen again. Can you possibly forgive me?" A little pause, long enough for Frank to doubt whether the reaction was entirely spontaneous and unplanned, or whether it was the subject of fierce inner debate. And then Radu hugged back and smiled. "I always do." "Your father missed you too." The two tall men, one alive, one dead, looked at each other over her head. A long, flat look, as if each were daring the other to break first. At length Constantine shrugged one bony shoulder. "It's true I turned the boy to annoy you. You had been ignoring us. You old monster. You could have just sent me a note." Frank wasn't thinking that this was all a little cosy for a plan to end the war. He wasn't thinking that he had misjudged the amount of affection on both sides of this little demonic family. But it was taking him an increasing amount of effort not to think these things. He turned away from the three of them, across to where the torches and lit windows of the city shone through the thickening fog, and cold speared through him a second time. A white blur on a dark shadow moved, stepped close enough for him to see the sallow yellow skin, the long rat teeth, clumps of hair falling from its skull and the bones showing from its arms. It stood watching him, with eyes as flat and expressionless as a shark's. And as it waited, another emerged to his right, and then a third. "Radu!" Radu looked, as they continued to come singly and in pairs. He beckoned, and Frank scurried to him, breathing hard as the graveyard crowd grew. Still there wasn't a sound from any of them. "They're fledglings," he explained, in the same voice he used for talking philosophy. "Still halfway through their transformation. Their human bodies are decaying. The spiritual body is not yet fully congealed. They'll be handsomer when they're finished. I'm surprised young Stefan looked as good as he did." "These we just tolerate." Elia smiled at them all, with the condescending pride of an owner toward her dog. "Him we encouraged." As the night deepened, Radu's lantern shone out intensely gold, making a sphere of illusory safety in the cold and dripping silence of the fog. Watching more of the revenants take their places at the edge of the light, there must be 100 of the things by now, Frank was struck by the eerie feeling that he was the only human left. Radu was so unaffected, so confident in his fearlessness, that he almost convinced Frank he belonged with the dead rather than the living. "Let us not speak about Stefan," he was saying. "That death has put your position in some peril. At your hand, son." Constantine levelled a measuring look at Radu. Frank could almost see the calculation there, the knowledge that here was someone who might pose a threat, balanced against the loyalty owed to family. "Though we have bred our line for strength, I did not think you had such violence in you." All around them the fledglings took a step forward. Frank, who had lately learned from his own father exactly how much the loyalty due family counted, swallowed and crowded closer to the light. "Mislike me not for being what you taught me to be." Finally, Radu seemed to take stock, recognized that he was being threatened. He came to the point. "But hear me now, father. You rode with Vlad Tepes, did you not, when he went to take the faith to the Turks and free our people from their oppression?" "I did." Constantine retreated so that he could sit down on the damp marble steps of his mausoleum. Elia moved to stand beside him. This left space for Frank and Radu to come a little way from the ring of watching corpses, though Frank still felt their thirsty gazes like a spiked collar all around his throat. "You have often spoken to me of the degeneracy of our own times, and how we should not have given up that fight until it was won." "I have. Though I am dead, I retain more true patriotism than any of the fat sycophants and fawning adulterers of this generation's court." Radu smiled. "How would you like to go to Istanbul? Here in Bucharest you feed on your own people. It will be wise of you to restrain yourselves and ration your kills, lest you eat the entire city and despoil our own country. But the Sultan has commanded us to provide him with troops. We go by ship to a muster in Constantinople itself." Alaya clapped her hands together before her mouth and bounced on her toes like the 15-year-old girl she had once been, offered a fine gown or a ball in her honour. "In Istanbul," Radu went on, not letting himself smile at this, his eyes fixed on his father, "there are 5 times as many people as there are in Bucharest, and they are all our enemies. You could feast without restraint, avenge Dracul and Brancovionu and all the other martyrs. You could finally do what they could not, and decimate the Turk from within." "A crusade." Constantine stroked his beard thoughtfully. "To finish what I began when I was alive. I like it." "You will be saving your own people." Radu reached out and squeezed Frank's forearm, in a grip he thought was meant to be reassuring. And Frank's too, for the Turks have called for war against Frank's country. Frank drew in a deep breath and regretted it the moment the stench of decaying flesh hit the back of his throat. But this was the plan to make everything right? Not to destroy the creatures, but to let them loose? It was true he had no love for the Turks. They had declared war on Britain, and he wanted them stopped. More than that, there was not a village on the coast without its history of terror at the hands of the white slave traders. The Barbary corsairs who answered to the Sultan for centuries had carried off the flower of English womanhood to debase in their harems, young boys to be gelded for the same purpose, and men to be chained to the oars of galleys, starved and worked to death. "I have men from Valchia coming with wagons to transport you and your creatures to Tomisovara, where we will be provided with ships to take us down the coast of the Black Sea to Istanbul. There we will be expected to disembark to be given our orders. If the fledglings can be complete by then, I will land you as my troops. From there I suggest you destroy the Janissaries first, but you will do as you wish, I'm sure. You always do." "Ravagers of our men, despoilers of our women," Frank's father had told him. "Idol worshippers, devil worshippers more like, corrupt, cruel and depraved, poised to overrun the cradle of Western civilization. It has always been our sacred duty to resist them, to drive them back, and perhaps one day regain the holy cities for our own." It felt natural to hear Radu speak the same language. More than understandable, since his people had lived that much closer to the threat, had feared and fought it almost since the time of the Romans. But if that was natural, then Frank must be unnatural in this respect too, because the thought of turning an army of these creatures loose on his enemies gave him no joy at all. Knowing it was something else Radu did partly for his sake made him want to tear his own skin off, put his hands in his cleft chest and pluck out his own heart. "What do you say?" "Oh, darling, let's. Just think of all the juice we could squeeze from such a big city." Constantine smiled and raised a hand, as though they were will-o'-the-wisps that the movement of the air had snuffed out. The standing army of the undead disappeared suddenly from behind Frank's back. Their master reached out a long white hand and ruffled Radu's hair. He wore a small, pleased smile that made the tips of his fangs poke out beneath his lips. "To war, then. After so long, I feel almost alive." "What if we wanted to recruit?" Alaya asked sweetly. "Better to take a big army than a small one, yes?" "No." The little glowing moment of mutual smugness passed. Radu's face firmed up again from hopeful to stern. "I believe I can find transport for those you already have. I could not bring more. Besides, I have already told the officials in charge of the graveyards to burn any new dead as soon as they arrive. It takes a strong will for a Strigoi to assemble a body out of ashes, so I've heard. There will be no more youngsters here." Constantine gave Radu that look again, the one that Frank read as, "Are you getting to be more trouble than you're worth?" "And in Istanbul? Take as many as you like. I don't care, eat them all." Constantine beamed with fatherly pride, seized Radu by the elbows and leaned in, embracing him and kissing him on the cheek 3 times, without even breaking the skin. "You have my word." Frank didn't know what to think of himself at the realization that some of the black bitterness in his chest came from jealousy. Some families were loyal to one another even across the barrier of death and species. Why then should his own have broken so easily? Was he really worse than this? Chapter 12, in which Ecaterina discovers the terrible truth. Ecaterina should not have been grateful for the fact that she was not the only heavily veiled mourner in the street, but she was. Not that sharing the grief with others made it easier to bear. If anything, it made her angry that Stefan was not getting his due of sorrow because all these other people were clamouring for a share too. But it did mean that she was protected from recognition as she walked about the city. After courteously expressed death threats in the post, and finding a pouch of hair and iron nails, a tiny bottle of water and of salt tucked under the porch door step, a clear attempt to cast the evil eye on her, she had begun to feel under siege. A pall of smoke from the graveyards darkened the summer sky and made the light yellow-grey. Ash was falling like dirtied snow. It had needed the driest tinder and most seasoned wood to build the first pyre, but now they were true bone fires and fed themselves on the fat and the skeletons of the city's many dead. She didn't at first distinguish the smell of wood smoke from that of burning fat, not until she turned the corner and came into the quiet end of Furriers Street, where for the past 3 years she had rented the rooms for her salon. There a whiter smoke gathered in cloud-like roiling, the building itself gutted and smouldering, a heat haze still wriggling over the acrid black spikes of wood that poked from the tumbles of brick. 4 other figures, huddled close to each other, stood next to what had once been the door. All of them looked at her sharply when she exclaimed, "No!" and darted forward as if to run inside. There had been books in there. There had been her master bibliography, her guide to which grimoires were worth the study and which were mere swamps of lies. She scrambled over the blackened doorstep, her coal-black shoes crunching over a surface that still exhaled heat. There had been a mirror in here, which the Englishman had had some success at enchanting. It must still be in here somewhere, and maybe she could rescue... A hand caught her shoulder, and another closed on her skirt, pulling her out of the still steaming wreckage. She turned on them. "I have to find—" "I don't think so." The hand at her shoulder belonged to Bogdan. "I think, with the country at war, perhaps we should all move on." She didn't like his narrow, displeased look, politely contemptuous, as if he'd been served a dish of rotted eel at a state banquet and was trying not to spit it out over the floor. Since he clearly knew it was she folded her veil back over her headdress to reveal her blotchy, unhandsome face. If he would scowl, she would give him a reason. That mirror could be invaluable in battle, for a general to see the whole battlefield at once, where the enemy feints, where his sappers tunnel under. I should present it to the voivode at once, as an earnest of what the mages of Bucharest can achieve. "Madam," Bogdan drew himself up, all sharp edges and glitter, "do you think the voivode, or anyone else, would trust you again, now it's known how you gulled us all this time? I think not. I suggest for your father's sake you do the decent thing, and find a nunnery that will take you in, For surely no decent man will ever have you to wife if he values his independency and the ability to be his own man." "That's what you came to say to me?" "It is." "Then good day, sir." She gave him an achingly correct curtsy and sized up the others of his little band as he walked away. Two Roma women, looking sympathetic yet also vaguely amused, and a tall, sprightly young man with red hair whom she didn't recognise at all. "We can take the meeting to my house. I can have someone dig through the wreckage tomorrow once it's cooled. This doesn't have to be—" "Your pardon, lady," said the eldest woman, running one of her necklaces of coins through her fingers. "But it seems to me you will not benefit from associating with the likes of us, and we will not benefit from your reputation neither. We get blamed for everything as it is, so we're not interested in catching this sort of trouble. We'll be going back to our husbands now, and telling them to keep well away." That left Ecaterina standing outside the wreck of her salon, with half her face flushed from the heat, and the other half red with anger. The strange young man shrugged at her, and opened his mouth to say something, when a bottle hurled from a passing carriage burst on the ground between them and showered them both with glass. "Evil witch!" a woman's voice yelled. "I hope you've suffered as you have made my son's poor heart suffer. All false, 1,000 times false." Ecaterina kicked at glass that smelled of palinka. "Do you know the story of the garden in which everyone looks beautiful?" she asked her one remaining companion. That ended much like this. "At least the village girl got a little time with her prince," said the redhead, and grinned in a way Ecaterina thought she recognised. Even if she had stayed beautiful and they'd married, who'd to say it would have ended well anyway? No one ever suggests she was wrong to trick him in the first place, Ecaterina mused. The thought that she was living in a fairy tale eased her heart a little, made the distress seem outside herself, poetic and therefore easier to live with. "Oh, well, if you'd done it to gain your true love, that would have been understandable," said the boy, in an offhand, careless way that just made Ecaterina surer of her guess. But for just having fun and being invited to parties and laughing at the girls and making the boys jealous of each other, maybe they think that's selfish. But you know how it is, to want to be someone different, someone better than yourself. It is Mirella under there, isn't it? She took off his cap and swiped a hand through his carroty hair. By the time the hand had fallen back to her side, she was a girl again, with curly ebony hair and dark skin, and much better clothes than Ecaterina had seen on her last time. "So I'm guessing no more salon, no more learning things for us and for our—" She took a run up to the word and hurdled it hastily. "Posterity?" The sound of trotting hooves and wooden wheels on wooden street, rattling like the cogs of a water-wheel. Ecaterina recognised the same matched pair of horses she had heard before, grabbed Mirella by the wrist and pulled her along to the closest church. They had just ducked inside when the carriage, obviously having made a great circle for the sole purpose of hurling more things at her, came past again. "I'm not going to let them stop me. If more people were involved in magic, there wouldn't be all this war. We'd be able to concentrate on the important things, like getting these monsters out of our city." They had stepped into a richer world, white and gold and pink marble all around. Painted stars gleamed above out of a richly indigo sky, where angels were making music among pink and violet clouds. The arched rooms of the church, entrance and nave, sanctuary and aisles, were heavy with the sort of silence left behind by many people thinking and feeling passionately. There was smoke here too, but it smelled of rare spices, heady and warm. Off the side of the right-hand aisle, a series of carved oak partitions had been set up, marking chapels dedicated to individual saints and martyrs. They ducked into the smallest, where an all but extinguished candle gave out a dim storm light in its amethyst lantern, and a silver-mounted icon of Saint Parasheva watched them with almond-shaped eyes. Ecaterina cast the veil back over her face. Mirella knelt beside her, and in the process of lowering herself she turned from girl into old lady, wrapped in black shawls, concealed behind a heavy headscarf and a shape that proclaimed her of no interest to anybody. "I envy your gift," Ecaterina said softly, "to pass unseen. I had to choose between peacock and gargoyle, and never truly wanted either." "Always the same on the inside, though, isn't it, who you are?" Mirella exchanged a glance with the flat saint. A stuttering light made her eyes gleam. If Ecaterina looked at her long enough, it was as though her face bulged out of the frame, became rounded and real. She was listening, though she didn't speak. "About the monsters," Mirella whispered. "My lord is taking them away. I thought you'd like to know that. We have wagons and everything arriving. I hear the idea is to jam them in, tight as slave ships, in the bottom of the carts, and cover them up with supplies. Then when the army gets down to the coast, they'll sneak aboard ship, and we'll take them with us. So you'll be all right back here. They'll all have gone to war, like the boyars." Ecaterina was ashamed of herself, because the first thing she thought was that the girl was lying. But lies ought to, at least, be more plausible than the truth, or how could they ever be believed? How could he control them enough to do that? How could he get them to cooperate? Nightmares flickered into her thoughts like the death throes of the candle. She saw again the look that had passed between Vacarescu and the Strigoi in the white silk, the old man who had taken Stefan from his family and walked beside him as a surrogate father. He'd brought the Strigoi with him from Valtia, the white one and the lady. They listened to him maybe a little, though God knows for how long now there's only one of him and hundreds of them. Ecaterina took far too long to understand this news. Her father admired the man, had told her of his awkward reception to the prince's court, the reason he'd given for not being seen in town before. "I have been containing a plague." The White Death had come to Bucharest but days after he arrived in it. Her teeth were chattering. She had to raise both hands and dig in her thumbs beneath the jaw to keep them silent, though the shudder worked through her wrists and arms and into her shoulders. The emotion she felt was still almost too big to put a name to, too big to be contained. She felt it like a wall of fire around her, 10 paces deep. The altar was inside it, and the green-faced saint, and the sense of something teetering, about to fall. Her father liked him, had welcomed him without reservation, brought him into her house. She had liked him. He was the only one still left who treated her as he had before her glamour slipped, the only one who saw her as she was and was not repelled. And why should he be repelled by anything human if his household was made up of monsters? How smoothly he had lied when she asked about the old man, led her to believe he was an unpleasant surprise he found waiting for him when he moved in. She should have known the timing was far too coincidental for that. She should have known when he hacked her brother's head off in front of her that he had no human sensibility in him. But for him, Stefan would still be alive. The Strigoi, oh yes, she could hope and plan for it to be destroyed, but it could not help its nature. It had little choice but to be what it was. But Vacarescu had chosen to expose her family to its notice, to expose all Bucharest to its curse. Had Stefan done something to him to be so targeted? No. Absurd. Stefan was the kindest child who ever lived. It was worse than that. Vacarescu had killed him and not even meant to, simply did not care enough to make it stop. The sphere of fire had reached its largest point, almost out into the street. Now it slowed, turned, and rushed back together like a fireball centred in her gut. Every part of her felt incandescent like the sun with rage. Powerful, unstoppable. I will kill him for this. I will have vengeance for my brother and for every other mourner in the city today. I will have justice. Katya, are you well? She blinked, aware again, and surprised to find Mirella's borrowed face close to hers. A hand on her arm, undecided between support and shaking. I thought everyone knew that. Where I come from, everyone knows. Perhaps I shouldn't have said. You can forget I said it, can't you? With this new heat inside her, Ecaterina could almost have laughed at that. Forget? Not likely. You said we'll take them with us. Are you going to war? You are not a man, so no matter what you look. Mirella shrugged one shoulder, an oddly girlish gesture from the crone she appeared. You don't want to see what will happen when the Turkish army meets our undead one? I suppose I could stay here and dance for men who think I'm just a free whore. But I went off that when they gave me up to die. Now, I don't know what I want, but if I don't go and see, I never will. Ecaterina had spent every moment since Stefan's death feeling hollowed out inside. Now that hollow ached less, filled as it was with purpose. She had been turning over a reply to the girl when she felt it, a sort of snag, as though a harp string had caught her sleeve, but within her. Wait a moment. She folded her hands in prayer, fixed her eyes on the eyes of the saint, and felt again for the little catch and thrum. With her mind turned inward, she could almost see it, a thread of blue-white along her spine. It twisted up her backbone and curled around her skull in one long spiral, returned along her breastbone and thence to her belly, where it spilled out into the world from an oval place, a finger's width down from her navel. 2 colours. It was a 2-coloured strand, the white and the blue so intertwined as to look silver. If she took the crackling fire of her anger and applied it to the blue line, the two sprung apart like a magnet rejecting its like. But if she touched it to the white, it brightened, and a burst of fullness, of pleasure and confidence whipped through her bones and soaked slowly into her blood. After minutes of silence, she felt it rise from her blood to her skin and paint it with energy. She threw back her veil once more. What do you see? Is it back? The glamour. I felt it this time. I made it happen. Mirella twisted her age-spotted hands in her lap as she looked. She scrunched up her face thoughtfully. I don't see anything different. Something happened. Yes. Mirella smiled, a big, easy smile with undertones of relief. But it's not the beauty that's come back, only that I suddenly really like you again. It's probably the best thing you could have done. You're making people love you without seeing you as a towering beauty. Now you can force them to like you, and they won't have any idea that you're raping their minds again. They'll forgive you because they have no choice, and they won't even know it. Raping their minds was ridiculous. She was doing no more than any woman who had trained herself to appear personable and charming. But this was good. It was exactly what she wanted. The power without the appearance of it. Tell me more about your plans to go to war, then. I think I would like to come. In the end, it proved easier than she could possibly have imagined. Her father was distracted, organising his own troops, and she could climb into the attic and hunt through centuries of trunks of outdated clothes. She assembled an outfit suitable for a young Haiduk, stitched herself a singlet that squashed her chest flat, and cut off her hair at shoulder length. Her head felt strange without it, lighter and less anchored, like it might float off to war without her. Since her hair was never seen, hidden modestly beneath headdresses and pearls. Her parents noted nothing. Or if they did, her renewed likability prevented them from mentioning it. She stole food and a bedroll for her backpack, wrote her mother a letter apologising for the anguish she had so recently caused, and promising to return once Stefan had been avenged. Then, on the day when the armies finally marched, she waved her father off from the front door, a sombre shadow in petticoats, then ran up to her room, flung the skirts off in favour of trousers, slung her pack on her back, and went out through the armoury. There she picked up a sword and a rifle, and running out of the back door, caught up with the train of wagons and foot soldiers as it passed out onto the road. "What the fuck are you doing?" said the last man in the line, as she sprinted up so hard she jostled him. He turned to her with a growl and a look like murder, and then his face cleared, and his eyes widened, and he broke out into a delighted smile. "Oh, sorry, mate. Didn't see you there. Go on ahead of me. I bet they'd let you ride in the wagons if you're tired." She wasn't, but when she smiled at the faces in the back of the last cart, they'd hoisted her up anyway, and left her there when everyone else took turns about to walk. So she went to war sitting on a warm sack of grain, with young girls along the route showering her with flowers, and it was as though she'd woken up to find the colour in the world had come back all at once, and she loved it all the more for that. This half-glamour was a great improvement on the old. All the advantages that came with being supernaturally likeable, and none of the disadvantages of great beauty. When she returned home again, and as all-powerful as she felt at the moment, it did not occur to her to doubt that she would have to devote some time to experimenting on what else she could do with the innate power, now she had discovered there was more to it than simply having it, like a sluice gate, either open or closed. But this, riding in a cart with a dozen other soldiers, was no place either for self-examination or for sudden changes of appearance. So she settled herself to sit and learn what she could of the battle plans, while the countryside slowly changed from fertile fields to salt marsh, and seagulls began to wheel overhead with sharp cries from voices made of metal. Halfway through the first day, her father's wagons caught up with those of Vacarescu. Glad to slip the chance of her father riding back along the column and seeing her, for he seemed the most likely to see through a disguise of short hair and man's coat, Ecaterina jumped down from her wagon and walked up to see if she could join the other boyar's men. This was not quite as easy, as Vacarescu's men were all on horseback, and no one rode in his covered carts. Knowing what she did not want to risk being in or close to those carts at nightfall. But she could not walk beside them without being spotted, and Vacarescu too seemed likely to see through her disguise. She considered simply asking one of his men to let her borrow his horse, riding up to the head of the column, shooting him in plain sight, and trusting in her glamour to make all the watchers unwilling to punish her. She would plead her brother's death, and weep, and she knew she could have them eating out of her hand within minutes. But it was widely known in Bucharest that she had laid a spell on herself to make men her slaves. Without the beauty, clearly recognisable as who she was, she might be able to get away with a murder in the short term, but they would remember it, remember her. Sooner or later someone would find a way of breaking the glamour, or it would slip again by itself as it had these past weeks. Then, even if she was not burned as a witch, she would be forced to become the outlaw she now pretended to be. Besides, she didn't want to think of her father's reaction if he had to watch. Her rifle felt heavy and reluctant on her back at the thought. So she pulled her hood more firmly down over her face and went back to her father's train. There would be time when they arrived at Tomisovara. In a crush of different nobles, all trying to embark their entourages on different ships, there would be a chance to lurch against Vacarescu in the back room of a harbour inn and slip a blade between his ribs. or find a room upstairs in a cheap hotel where she could sit in a window and shoot him as he passed below. She had not reckoned on arriving at Timisoara at night. The road ran out into sand. The wagons drew to a halt, and from the back of Vacarescu's covered carts, which had been so innocently empty up until now, an army climbed down. They had all of Stefan's eerie stillness. Drawn up in rough lines on the quayside, they stood without fidgeting, without breathing, all looking out together at the Turkish troop transport ship that was rowing with long sweeps toward the town's single jetty. Anchored out in the bay, a second ship waited its turn to take on her father's men, and a third was just dropping anchor beside it. That one would come in the morning and transport whichever noble arrived next. The first ship tied up to the dock. From the first of Vacarescu's wagons, a white figure emerged, followed by a smaller one clad in flickering blue. Ecaterina had been tired and dispirited, a long way away from home, having second thoughts. But the sight of him, white-bearded, with a starburst of diamonds in his hat, made prickly cold roll over her skin, stopped her breath. So Mirella hadn't lied. Vacarescu knew of the Strigoi, was in league with him, and by malice or neglect had caused her brother's death. She strode forward, shrugging her rifle into her hand. Vacarescu dismounted from his horse and stood beside the White Lord. She saw with a certain feeling of betrayal that Frank Caro was there too, though he looked as though he would not be removed from his horse by anything short of a lightning strike, his eyes as wide and frightened as his mount's. Already the sailors, jumping from their ship like fleas from a big dog, had flung down a gangplank and begun to help with the unloading of the wagons. This was her chance. In the middle of such bustle, in the dark, who would see her preparing to fire until it was too late? She took another couple of steps forward, getting a better angle, rammed powder, shot and wadding into her rifle, primed the pan and raised the long, heavy weapon to her shoulder. Just almost, yes. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The white Strigoi stepped in front of her prey, and at the same time a long arm knocked the barrel of her gun up toward the sky, grabbed it firmly and resisted her every attempt to pull it back down. Cursing, she turned to find an elderly gentleman with a moony moustache and a coat embroidered all over with flowers. "Let me go!" "Son," said this pest, in a tone of paternal concern, "don't. A bullet can't stop him. All you'd do would be to make them all very interested in you, and you don't want that, am I right?" He thought... She recovered from the shock quick as she could. He thought she had been aiming for the White Sire. He had not attacked her, he was trying to protect her. The glamour had not failed again. She was safe. Safe, but thwarted, because Vacarescu had taken the chance to walk up the gangplank and disappear into the belly of the ship. Ecaterina let go of the rifle, allowed her unwanted rescuer to lift it out of her hands and lowered it to rest, nicely away from the muck of the seashore, on the tip of his boot, mouth still facing the sky. The moment allowed her to think. Son, he'd called her. So all was well. All of them? She pitched her voice, low and husky, hauling it out of her stomach and making her throat ache, trying for an incredulity that did not give away the fact that she already knew this. "You don't mean Vacarescu's army is all Strigoi?" "Ah." He stroked his moustache, first one side, then the other, and he thought he recalculated himself after an inadvertent slip. "Not all. I'm not, for example. But many. It doesn't please you, the thought of unleashing our monsters on the Turks?" This must be some country retainer of Vacarescu's. He would never have lasted 5 minutes in the voivode's court with that tendency to tell all his master's plans to anyone who would listen. "The Turks? I thought we were fighting the British." He laughed, half warm, half rueful. "So I'm sure we will, once we've dropped off our little friends in the city of Istanbul. But now I've told you this, it occurs to me it's not a story I want you to spread around." He ran a suddenly much shrewder eye over her clothes. "Who's your lord?" "I have none." "You're certainly dressed as a bandit, though young for it. Run away from home to go to war?" She decided that her own truth was safe enough to share. "Ran away for vengeance. That thing, that white thing, it killed my brother. I'm going to kill it in return." Vacarescu's household army of demons had begun trailing up the gangplank after him, some of them carrying what looked like cases of rifles between them. Cases large enough for a man to squeeze inside. Where would they bury them on a ship? What would they do in the daytime if they fed on the sailors at night? Did Vacarescu have enough control to stop them feeding? If not, the whole ship was doomed on the second day with no one left to work the sails. That would not be such a bad thing. The older gentleman followed her gaze. For a moment she surprised a look of great weariness on his face. "Shot won't do it," he said quietly. "If you're capable of getting close enough to behead him and drive a stake through his heart, you are a better man than I." Stefan's final moments returned to her, as though a spray of blood had spattered the back of her eyes. She and Frank pinned, unable to move, magic users as defenceless as if they had none at all. "Then isn't it a good thing it isn't him I'm really after?" For a moment her heart faltered. Why was it not the Strigoi on whom she meant to wreak vengeance? What if Vacarescu himself had not known what his pet was up to? Would he have spared Stefan if he could? There were 100 dead men here who would not have been dead if Vacarescu had stayed in his mountains, and every one of them was someone's brother, lover, husband or father. He was owed repayment for them too. "I have to try." "You can't be happy just to know that our country is rid of him? That he's to become our enemy's problem?" Truth be told, she did rather like the idea of the Strigoi rampaging through the Ottoman Empire. That would teach them what came of killing Wallach's princes and subjugating them to a Greek. If Vacarescu had proposed the idea before Stefan, she would have had no quarrel with him. She might have found it ingenious and rather funny. A dead brother changed many things. "I want him to know that he dies for my brother's sake. Out of all the hundreds of people he has killed, I want him to regret he ever touched my kin." Another laugh, and then her rescuer handed her her rifle back and began to shrug out of his coat. She looked askance at him as he held it out to her, and he shrugged. "I, too, would be happy to see Constantine finally sleeping his long sleep. And my lord would be indebted to you if you could manage it. Does he care?" That came out harsher than she wished. He stepped back, and she caught the moment the power of her glamour reasserted itself, his offence and suspicion vanishing in the flood of her magical trustworthiness. "Of course he cares," he said, frowning. "He's as much a prisoner of the things as the rest of us, perhaps more. Take my coat. They hunt by scent, and they will recognize mine as that of someone who is not to be harmed. It should cling for a couple of days. If you try and succeed, I will put you in a boat afterward, before the scent has time to fade." So easy was life when everyone liked you. It was like being a princess in one of the old tales, where a good fairy appeared at every hurdle to make the most impossible of quests routine. "My thanks," she said, and gave him her own coat in return. It was one her father had worn in his youth, before he grew so round, and fitted him not too badly. But the good fairy's coat was well worn and well loved, often repaired, with tiny stitches of trailing vines of roses and honeysuckle and water lilies, The colours had faded, but there was no mistaking the devotion that had led someone to pour weeks of her best work into the craft. "Your wife made this?" Guilt struck Ecaterina suddenly. At the censure and insults, the petty harms and shunning of the court, since she had been exposed, she had felt nothing more than anger and contempt for them. But at this easy cousining of a man out of his most treasured possession, she began to see why her victims had felt so used. "Yes." He stroked a gentle hand down one sleeve and smiled. "She's dead now. Has been for some time. I don't believe she'll mind my giving it to one with so noble a purpose, if she's peeping out of the grave to see. I'll make sure it comes home to you." Ecaterina could not quite understand why her eyes prickled with tears. "What's your name, kind sir?" Cesar Dobre. "I am Catalin." Impulsively, she reached out and clasped his arm, hoped too late that he would not feel how thin and unmanly was her bicep beneath its bulky sleeve. But if he did, he didn't mention it. He just nodded, and turning, began to walk up to the ship. Falling in beside him, feeling the gangplanks spring beneath her feet, and then the unquiet heave of the deck, she was grateful for his reassuring presence beside her. On the deck, a cauldron of frantic activity seethed. Sailors clustered around a tall wooden cylinder that rose out of the planking toward the front. They were fitting long bars into the slots at its top, getting ready to wind something up. From the rear of the ship, where there was a raised deck, 4 more sailors were taking bundles of material and rope out from a wall and handing them to Vacarescu's soldiers. The owner, captain, or master of the ship, she didn't know which he was, stood on top of the rail that separated the raised deck from the lower, bellowing into a bass trumpet. From his sour look and his beautiful coat, she guessed he was a successful merchant, pressed into service by the agents of the Sultan to transport the army, and not at all happy about it. "Take a hammock, then get below. Someone will teach you how to sling them. When that's done, get into them and out of our way. Stay there. You'll be assigned to watches and fed when they are fed, but apart from meals, I do not want to see any of you on my decks. Anyone who interferes with my men or my discipline on my ship will be flogged. Are we clear?" Rhetorical question, obviously. He didn't wait for an answer, jumping down and striding off to the small wooden hut at the back of the ship. Ecaterina felt suddenly very aware that she was standing in the middle of the deck, conspicuously doing nothing, and there was no sign of her prey anywhere on board. Would he too be in the cabin? If that was where the high-ranking people went, then probably. She headed for the steps up to that part of the deck, but was caught before she could put a foot on the first riser. Warm hands on her arms, not cold. Sailors, then, not Strigoi. She wasn't sure she liked either, but they wore the tolerant grins of grandmothers left in charge of a room full of boisterous toddlers. "Can't go up there, mate. You've got to go down below. Didn't you hear? Now." A surprisingly heavy bundle of cloth was thrust into her arms, making it impossible to draw rifle or sword. "Take this and go downstairs." He said downstairs as if it was a foreign word, which he found distasteful to pronounce. "Get yourself a good space before it's all snapped up." Compared to the deck, the next level down was ghostly silent, but for the creaking of timber and wind. In the centre of the vaulted space, a large cast-iron range stood cold, and hammocks did indeed hang from every inch of the floor above, but they were limp and flaccid, the reworking larvae inside, prematurely escaped. Ecaterina unwound hers, and found cleverly made eyes of rope on either end, which, after studying how the others had done it, she hooked to the first available beam with a couple of S-shaped hooks. There was still a little space left unclaimed toward the front, where a latrine stench filtered through the heavy wooden walls. Down here there was no sound of footsteps. But when she had hung her bed and turned, she saw a steady movement of figures down the steep stairs and down again into the next level. Uncanny how they walked, as though they were made of wax and not bone. Once or twice one would pause and look at her, lift its head and snuff the air. But Cesar's coat did its work. They frowned and drifted away. There was no one else on this level. No sign of Vacarescu. He was either up in the great cabin or down in a lower deck. Unable to look in the cabin, she joined the cold, silent procession of bodies down into the hold. Cold struck her to the marrow the minute she ducked her head below the floor. The walls around her glimmered as water seeped through the planks of the hull. A lantern shone over a half-deck to the squarer back end of the ship, and there, because God was righteous, she made out the voice of her prey. She could just see him through a doorway in a wall made of canvas. He stood on one side of a scrubbed wooden table, covered with gruesome instruments, and on the other side stood a man in the blood-soaked apron of a ship's doctor. Even as she watched, the doctor took his apron off and set it aside in a small chest, poured himself a bowl of water and began scrubbing the brown stains from his fingers. The quiet procession of Strigoi down and further down continued. Vacarescu was gesturing at the doctor's scalpels now, concocting some tale, presumably, that would convince the man to wash them too. She wondered why he bothered, when he had done nothing for Stefan. It couldn't hurt to see what the Strigoi were up to. She climbed backward down the final ladder into the hold. It was shaped like the rib cage of a whale, the dim light from the lantern on the deck above only just showing looming bulks of equipment carefully stacked and tied. Beneath that, the keel was covered with a deep layer of gravel, wet from the constant snake of water down the walls. One by one, the Strigoi were sinking to their knees and shoveling this aside, tunnelling down into the ballast like razor worms sucking themselves under the beach. The wet, cold air was full of a swish, swish sound as the sea's movement stirred the little pebbles on top of these watery graves. The roll of the sea was far more marked now, Ecaterina realised. The lantern above made a restless circle as it swung. They were no longer docked. The swish noise was joined by a lower, more urgent thrum as the pillars of the masts trembled with stress. She had barely time to notice that they were under way, when the pirouetting light slid over something icy blue. And then the rope ladder on which she hung jerked and clattered against the side as a body joined hers on it, and a small hand with a sapphire ring closed over her ankle. A pause, where it seemed the world froze with her. She was aware of big blue eyes examining her face, of fine white cheeks and a blush like a rose, and a red mouth parted in surprise. "You smell like Cesar, but you don't look like him." The clues joined up into certainty. She'd seen a little figure blue like this come out of Vacarescu's cart on the White Sire's arm. The hand on her foot was cold. She didn't think, just drew her sword and hacked down blindly at that upturned face. Felt the tip of the weapon catch in something firm. A ripping noise. The Strigoi flinched, and Ecaterina kicked out, freed her foot, and scrambled back up into the light. When her feet were on the all-up deck, she glanced back once more, saw she had dislodged the thing's headdress, and it was struggling with askew masses of torn silk and pins. Strangely clear, at the prospect of imminent death, Ecaterina thought, "Vengeance. I can die satisfied if I kill him first." Turning on her heel, she bolted for the doctor's office. The door was shut now, but it was only a canvas door. She slashed it open with her sword, burst through. The small room was crowded with witnesses, but that hardly mattered if she was going to die. Nothing mattered. What power there was in the instant before annihilation. There was her victim, struck dumb by the violence of her entry. He had scarcely begun to frown in bemusement before she had lunged and skewered him right through the ribs. Then everything went to hell. Vacarescu clutched at the wound, bowed forward, hissing between his teeth at the pain, but he did not fall. Bright red liquid bloomed under his fingers, filling the cabin with its warm metallic scent. Almost instantly, the canvas walls on 3 sides of the room bulged and rippled with seeking fingers before they were torn out of their mouldings and ripped apart. Their places were filled with a shrinking circle of animated bodies, all bones and teeth and hunger. 2 paces before the foremost of these inferior revenants, the beautiful young maiden Strigoi, with her hair hanging down to the backs of her knees, grabbed Ecaterina by the throat and pulled her in to bite. That was chapters 11 and 12 of Sons of Devils by Alex R. Oliver, read by Galadeer. The music was Gifts of Stars by Lloyd Rogers, used with thanks from Pixabay. Tune in next week to find out if anybody at all survives. Thanks for listening. See you then.